Welcome to today's presentation, Employees Yin and Yang Mindset and Intra-Firm Competition in Growth Companies. My name is David An. I have co-authored this paper together with Professor Markus Kreuzer. Today, I will speak about the following 5 agenda items. Number 1, about the motivation and the research gaps we have identified. What is the theoretical context, research design, findings, and what are the implications, limitations, and ideas for future research. First, about the phenomenon intra-firm competition. As we saw, many companies, for instance in the food delivery space, such as Amazon, we saw that they are practicing intra-firm competition in the following way. Amazon, for instance, in Germany, and I believe globally, is operating a service called Amazon Fresh. At the same time, they are competing in the market with companies like GetNow, Rewe, Bringmeister, and interestingly, what we saw is they have an almost similar service called Prime Now within the boundaries of the firm. So that means this is a very good example of internal competition where 2 services within the boundaries of the firm overlap, and at the same time internal cooperation where companies cooperate, although they compete in the market on issues, here in this example, logistics and customer service. In management research, intra-firm competition has also been a subject that has been scrutinized. For instance, it has been defined in general as, so competition in general, as simultaneous and cooperative and competitive interactions between actors. And the focus to date right now has primarily been that competition has been scrutinized between firms, mostly at the dyad level, or in industry networks. However, IFC, inter-firm competition, deals with the simultaneous occurrence of cooperation and competition within the boundary of the firm. And research to date has primarily looked at the unit of analysis regarding the unit itself, strategic business units, department, and team level. Some highlights of IFC literature. So why is it relevant? What has happened today? Some highlights. So intra-firm competition has been identified as a driver of knowledge sharing, explorative innovation, firm performance. Also, its antecedents have been scrutinized. For instance, what are the effects of organizational structures and leadership styles on IFC and formal hierarchical structures and informal relations. Also, with regard to the context of IFC, it is a global phenomenon, as I mentioned, and that it happens across industry has also been investigated by many scholars in the field, for instance in France, with case studies such as Samsung, and as I mentioned, Tencent and Google are international global companies. It is a phenomenon that deals with primarily, I wouldn't say primarily, but mostly with multi-unit and multi-channel related companies. So of course, internet and multi-channel strategies have actually amplified IFC, and also the fact that you have a lot of multi-unit organizations which operate on a global scale with multiple units, overlapping services, but at the same time cooperating, has been attracted the interest of researchers in the field. To clarify this a little bit further, IFC research opportunities and gaps. As I mentioned, especially when we ask the question, who do we actually analyze, we're dealing with the fact, what is the unit of analysis? And as I mentioned, it has been in the IFC area, primarily been with the focus on units, departments, and on the team level. However, the paradox of intra-firm competition, because 2 competing elements are there, is actually interesting to see how the individuals react to that. And for instance, with regard to a specific research gap, which we also addressed in another paper, is individual team productivity as a micro-foundation for performance. However, this paper deals with how employees deal with the paradox of intra-firm competition and what kind of behavioral strategies do they actually employ. So this is the title of today's paper, Employees' Yin and Yang Mindset in Intra-Firm Competition. And in another paper, which has been published this month, actually in the Industrial Marketing Management Journal, the effect of inter-team competition on individual team productivity has been scrutinized. So some, I would say, additional information and more detailed information on how do we look at the issue. So the status quo is IFC is a paradoxical phenomenon that creates tensions on the individual, team, and organizational levels. So it has been already addressed that this deals with, or individuals, to frame it differently, are actually dealing with paradox in organizations. And there are actually two schools of thought. Number one is the, I would say, the focus on a dichotomy, which says it's either or, so it's either competition or cooperation with opposing elements. And there's a trans-paradox perspective that reconciles those either or approaches into both ends. And of course, in management research, intra-firm competition has become a high priority for top management. So as I mentioned, there is a lack of a micro-foundational perspective on the paradoxical nature of IFC. And there's a lack of an empirical basis whether either a dichotomous or a trans-paradox perspective on an employee level is actually relevant here. Literature does not really address the orchestration of intra-firm competition and how it is received by employees. So we came up with two research questions for this paper. Number one, how do individual employees in organizations view and respond to the paradoxical phenomenon of intra-firm competition? And how do employees in growth companies perceive the way top managers orchestrate intra-firm competition? Now some more information on the theoretical context. So literature has moved towards a harmonization of opposing elements. So there is a view which I would call the neoclassical view, which is a highly Western perspective of competition. Basically, work from already starting in the 50s by Morton Deutsch distinguish competition from cooperation. So IFC is primarily viewed on a continuum of two contradictory elements that range also from weak to strong and strong to weak. And paradox is seen as contradictory and yet interrelated elements that seem logical in isolation but absurd and irrational when appearing simultaneously. So that is the neoclassical view. And I would say that the trans-paradox perspective by Chen is kind of harmonizing that. It has also the independent opposite competition, which is an either-or relation, so between competition and or cooperation. And at the same time, there is this issue of interconnected, interrelated opposite competition where teams and units compete on internal resources and or for market share externally. And then there is the interdependent opposite competition, which is both and basically has a harmonization of competitive and collaborative elements. Now some more information on the theoretical context. So we chose a company in Asia, which is a high growth company. The name of the company is anonymized, so Alpha Plus is not the real name of the company. And we chose a single case study. Why a single case study? Because single case studies typically exploit opportunities and that allow researchers to explore a significant phenomenon under rare or extreme circumstances. And so that was the case with Alpha Plus. It was showing an extreme growth and it was therefore an extremely rare and an extreme circumstance. On top of that, it was launched after a tsunami hit Japan. So the core of the company was a messenger in the sense of a internet-based communication messenger. So after the tsunami got hit, it grew from 2011 to 2017 to 150 million monthly active users, and to date has over 7,000 employees worldwide. So it was a phenomenal growth story which allowed us to explore this phenomenon of intra-firm competition under this really extreme and high growth scenario. And second, there was a high propensity of intra-firm competition since it was a messenger that had a lot of services on that platform. Naturally, we could induce that there would be intra-firm competition taking place. And it would also be a multi-unit organization with local subsidiaries in Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Taiwan, and with a lot of cash to invest. So therefore, the issue of competition on resources we could induce would also be most probably relevant. And we saw here in the figures that this is also underlining the growth aspect of the firm. The sky blue bars indicate the monthly active users growth, and the revenue is the dark blue line. So it was really from virtually 0 users and 0 revenues in 2011, growing to the high figure of almost 2 billion in revenues. Our research design was basically a grounded theory approach. In particular, we used the Joya method as it provided a very clear roadmap for a qualitative researcher. We started with an iteration where we had a couple of first round interviews with informants who worked at Alpha Plus. We initially then started transcribing the data and saw whether it would lead to any potentially interesting results in the data analysis. And then we started again in another iteration collecting data by actually flying to the venue in Seoul, interviewing another 15 informants face to face and one by a phone. And in addition, we of course looked for secondary data, articles, investor financial reports. Since the company is public, there is a lot of data available on this company. And we continuously engaged in open coding, triangulated the data, and used memoing in order to make sense of the data and actually corroborate the narratives and the statements and the codes. In the data analysis process, we came up with first order codes, second order codes, and we reached theoretical dimension as the more we actually increased the body of knowledge, we saw that no new first or and second order codes were actually added to the body of knowledge that we accumulated. So we felt very confident that we reached theoretical saturation. We then engaged in actual coding by asking when, where, why, how, and with what consequences in order to actually come up with a causal model and making sense of these first and second order codes. We had a coding check with colleagues and also discussed all relevant results with informants in order to confirm our findings. And finally, we came up with a grounded theory articulation. So basically a model which conceptualizes the data structure of first and second order codes. So basically, we achieved that the static structure of first and second order codes could be put together in a dynamic grounded theory model. Now coming to the findings. This is a statement that was very interesting, and I'm going to read it out loud, of one of the informants, which really underlines the findings that we came up with. So these two aspects cannot be separated into black and white. So by that he meant, like, of course, competition and cooperation, collaboration. Because in order to do competition, you need to have collaboration. And therefore, if I had to pick one or two of the two, I would personally pick collaboration, but I think it is difficult to divide them. So this was very much close to the philosophy of Yin and Yang, which basically postulates that Yin and Yang coexist in everything, and everything embraces Yin and Yang, and it gives rise to and complements and reinforces each other, and it exists within each other, and there's an interplay, reciprocal interplay of dynamic and paradoxical unity. This is the model that we finally came up with. So we have organizational context. We identified in the growth phase that the entrepreneurial autonomous culture platform as a business model, speed, and quick product launch has an effect on the perceptual salience of intra-firm competition. By perceptual salience, we mean how do actually employees view intra-firm competition? Do they really see it as salient? That means, as do they perceive it as existent, and does it have an effect on them? And then the second construct, or the second part category that we identified, was the CEO and top management actions, which could be categorized in three separate categories: active push, laissez-faire, and balance IFC. So which would apply the last two in the growth phase, whereas in the stagnation phase, they would actually, so the top management would actually push IFC a lot, and in the growth phase, they would actually let it happen and actually balance it. That was interesting to see. So we developed those propositions that these six concepts have a strong influence on the perceptual salience of intra-firm competition. And we identified that basically two streams of behavioral response and actions and strategies is: one is the balance and manage, the seize and grow together, which is a positive, I would say, reaction and behavior strategy towards a high perceptual salience of intra-firm competition. And then there is another strategy which we call deceive and overcompete, reject, and or leave. What was interesting to see is that relationship was heavily dependent on the employee cognitive response and the cognitive moderator that we identified, which we called and labeled as Yin and Yang mindset. And that Yin and Yang mindset was basically characterized by three elements: ubiquitous, necessity, and oneness. So in other words, would employees actually acknowledge that Yin and Yang was somewhere in, so collaboration, cooperation, and competition was somewhere, everywhere prevalent within the organization? And did they see it as necessary, and did they see it as actually one concept which does not oppose each other, but it's actually a harmonizing, so to say, fruitful in itself concept that is one, basically. So what do we actually contribute with regard to existing paradox literature? So, for instance, there is the paper from Lewis, who deals with a paradox framework, and interestingly uses Yin and Yang as a graphical representation of tensions as an antecedent to so-called self-reinforcement cycles. So what, however, is different to our finding is that Lewis basically sees that individuals simplify the reality in organizations that they face through in paradox, and then polarize these complex relationships in either or. So it's actually quite the opposite of what we actually saw. And another concept that is in literature is the aspect of duality as opposed to dualism by Farjun, and duality as opposed to dualism with two elements as interdependent, For instance, so basically duality being a harmonizer, so, and also seeing, for example, stability as an enabler of change, so that would underline duality as opposed to dualism, where these two aspects would still be in contrary to each other. Interestingly, there's another paper by AMJ, which was published in AMJ, The Paradox Mindset, which is very much where we see we complement the findings that the paradox mindset is basically something which helps employees to improve job performance and innovation. Implications, limitations, and future research. So our implications is for paradox theory and practitioners. Number one, we develop a holistic model of cognitive response and behavior strategies of employees towards a highly salient intra-firm competition based on an extreme insightful single case study. And second, important theoretical implication is that we identify a cognitive moderator, which we call the Yin and Yang mindset, which is a further development of the paradox mindset by Myron and Spector et al., which illustrates, and by illustrating the characteristics even further of ubiquity, necessity, and oneness. Further, we see that our paper is an application of a Taoist philosophy, which is increasingly interesting to be applied in management research as a foundation of productive employee behavior in response to a highly perceptual salience of intra-firm competition. And lastly, the managerial implication. This has huge implications for leadership development. So organizations in future have to really think about how do companies actually develop leaders in business organizations further in order to deal with paradox, in order to deal with conflicting elements of complexity and the speed of change that demands that managers really deal with those tensions effectively. So it has strong implications for that. And this could also be not only within organizations and within managers that already are in the organizations, but actually has an implication on hiring practices. So when you hire new people, and organizations should basically could incorporate these concepts like yin and yang into hiring practice and see, and via interview techniques, whether managers potentially fulfill the requirement of a yin and yang mindset that is able to deal with tensions in an effective manner. What are all limitations and future research? We have not, so the culture factors is important. Most of the informants that we have interviewed are from Korea, so there is a pre-existing yin and yang mind cognition which we haven't controlled for which would normally be done in a quantitative study. And so the cultural influence or the origin of yin and yang mindset, of course, is an important factor that should be taken into consideration, potentially for quantitative researchers in the future. And also the issue which came up in the discussions with regard to incentive systems is also interesting. What kind of incentives can be provided monetary-wise or recognition-wise? And what kind of importance does it have in relation, in comparison to a yin and yang mindset? Another factor that we believe is highly relevant, since we dealt with cognitions, is the issue of emotional ambivalence. So how do employees deal on an emotional level with paradox, such as IFC? And we saw that the simultaneous experience of positive and negative emotions can have a strong effect on organizational creativity, for instance. Thank you very much for today's presentation.